Michigan Liberation is a statewide network of people and organizations organizing to end the criminalization of Black families and communities of color in Michigan. We envision a state without mass incarceration, mass policing, and punishment. We envision a state with the best public education in the nation, single-payer health care, and thriving Black and brown communities. Here on the Respect the Roots podcast, we will lift up the stories and experiences of those impacted by mass incarceration, collective ties to the criminal legal system, and the frontline efforts to end mass incarceration.
Hey everybody, it's Miss Marjon back for another episode of Respect the Roots, Michigan Liberation's podcast. Today we are just going to talk some law talk. I got one of my buddies here. I just met him a couple weeks ago, Dan. He used to be a public defender in Pittsburgh, but now he's in Detroit and he's still doing the law thing. And without further ado, I want to bring him on. Dan, are you there? Can we hear you? Can you hear us?
I'm here. Great to be here. Great to meet you about a week ago, and then great to be on the podcast shortly thereafter.
That's what's up. That's what's up. Me and Dan did a one-on-one on Zoom, and I told him, you got to come on our podcast. He's done a one-on-one with one of my colleagues, Tim Christensen, and I heard it went well, and he's just an amazing guy. And Dan, I before we get started talking about criminal justice, the injustices of the criminal system, I want to talk about your bio and everything, because it's, we usually interview different people, but we haven't interviewed like one-on-one, public defender. And I want, when people listen, I want people to be on the same page as everybody else. What is a public defender?
Well, a public defender is somebody who works for the government, but we represent poor people who are charged with crimes. Poor people who are charged with crimes have a right to an attorney. That was established in Gideon versus Wainwright. So that's where public defenders' offices took off. They blossomed around the country. But some jurisdictions don't actually have public defenders' offices. They have various systems to enforce that right so that poor people charged with crimes get an attorney. They could have private attorneys that are basically contracted to represent poor people. So I actually work in Wayne County supporting what is mostly a managed assigned counsel system, which I just described, where it's mainly private attorneys who are paid hourly now. So they have incentives to represent poor people well. There is a commission in Michigan that establishes standards that they have to abide by. And we essentially, my department enforces those standards. We're given state funds and we fund these attorneys so that they can represent their clients well.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And you moved to Detroit in 2022 and everything. What led you to come to Michigan or come to Detroit? Was it the job or just the work or whatnot?
It was, yes, the job. I heard about this indigent defense department that was fairly new. The department itself, I think, started in 2021. There was a pilot project before then, but it sounds very interesting because we had the ability to build up a system that had done poorly in years past, and we had all this state funding, and it was very macro. So back in Pittsburgh, I was a public defender for a little over 10 years. I was a appellate attorney, trial attorney, then trial supervisor, then trial deputy. So I worked my way up, but then over time, I saw a lot of these same injustices. I was winning a lot of battles and losing the war. So I wanted to get out of that system. I wanted to change the pace. I wanted something more macro. And I also wanted the ability to do what I'm doing now, which is speak out about the injustices of the system. And back in my old county in Allegheny County, we were hamstrung in terms of talking to the media. The way the county was set up, it was real tight-lipped. So you always had to go through back channels to try to get the word out of the injustices. And it just wasn't very effective. So I felt muzzled. I wanted to get out, and now I'm going to speak about some of my experiences as a public defender in Pittsburgh.
Right. The injustices of the criminal system. I know you're passionate about that, Dan. So thank you for giving us an idea of, what it is, your background is. So now we can talk about the injustices of the criminal system? Because some people may just jump on and be like, okay, what kind of perspective are you bringing to the table? So let's go dig right deep into it, the injustices of the criminal system. And you're speaking from a lawyer perspective. It ain't just like you're just some Joe Blow from off the street. You've actually seen it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right, Dan?
Right, absolutely. I mean, a Joe Blow off the street may have some perspective if they're poor, if they're a person of color, because they've likely interacted with the system. So they actually might have some good perspective. But generally, the large majority of our citizenry, the country, is just not aware how the system works, how it processes people. It's really just it's a conveyor belt of processes that actually, in my opinion, and I've seen it firsthand, cause way more harm than they remedy. They actually perpetuate poverty. They create poverty themselves, these systems that are under the umbrella of the criminal, quote unquote, justice system. So I saw it firsthand. I was oblivious to the system growing up in a middle class suburb. So when I got launched into the system, it was sort of slow because I was doing a lot of writing, but I still moonlighted doing preliminary hearings, which is the first hearing after somebody is charged. So it was just kind of mind-blowing how the system works, how the system brought in a bunch of people in shackles and handcuffs. They just herd them in like cattle. The room is packed with people. Yeah, it's just very dehumanizing from the jump. So you have a very short amount of time to talk with people about their case before you decide to either waive the hearing, do a hearing, accept some sort of deal. So it's very, very quick. It just processes people. And the other thing that I noticed is how thin the evidence is in cases. So I want to get a couple points across. Number one, most of the large majority of cases filed are not what you hear about on TV. They're not rapes. They're not homicide. They're not anything violent. Violent crime overall, the stats show, are about like up to 5% of all arrests made. Mm-hmm. So it's not what you see on TV. Those just get the news. So it's mostly nonviolent, trivial stuff. But even the violent stuff, a lot of times, not every time, is supported by just bad evidence. You might have somebody who has a gripe against somebody else who decides to call the police first. Maybe there was a tussle. They both have minor injuries. But because this person called the police first, then the police charge your guy. And you're stuck with that. So you literally have a scratch to the other person and you have the other person's word. And that's the investigation. Charges filed. So what made it even worse in Pittsburgh was because the police would initiate the charges, whereas in a lot of other jurisdictions, they have to bring the allegations and potential charges to a prosecutor who screens them. Right. Whereas in Pittsburgh, most of the charges, even though the police were supposed to get some authorization from the prosecutors to file felony charges, they really wouldn't, or they would make a quick call and the prosecutor would just stamp it and say, yeah. So it was really the police driving everything. So that partly led to, in my opinion, just really thin evidence, if any evidence. I mean, so many times we had guns that would be found on the floorboard of a car or in a console. So there's a couple people in the car. Maybe it's just your client in the car, but it's somebody else's car. I mean, there's no physical evidence tying your client to this gun, but because they didn't have a license to carry, because they had something in their past that prohibited them from carrying a firearm or possessing a firearm, they would just be charged with it because they were close to it. Right. So there were so many cases that may look good on paper or scary on paper. It might be sexual assault. It might even be homicide. I had a client who was just charged with homicide because he was with some folks that shot at somebody thinking that this other person was somebody else. Right. With them minutes before. So it was just like this assumption that he must have had a role in it. And the person that was shot at says she sees him like on the side of the road, even though the shots are coming from the front of the car. So it's just these sort of things where really serious charges are filed with bare bones evidence. It's not what people think. A lot of times you have a robbery that's just a few sentences of allegations from some guy who has a bone to pick with your client, who has a bad history themselves in terms of the criminal system. So I really want to get that point across to people, that it's not just there's very few violent crimes. It's that, yes, if it's a violent crime, maybe people agree, let's treat it through the criminal punishment bureaucracy. But even though there's a lot of dispute there, should we even just punish people and cage them? But it's not just a violent crime. It's, you have to consider what is the evidence that supports that violent crime. And that doesn't get a lot of play.
Right.
And even reform circles or the media, they don't talk about that. There are no investigative standards for police departments. It's really all discretionary. If they want to believe somebody who says something happened, then they often file charges.
Wow. Now, Dan, I want to go into switch gears, and I want to talk about this, how the system disproportionately impacts people of color, and what you mean, like explaining that. Because also after this, we're going to talk a little bit later about your role, not really going into depth about where you work, but I just find it so fascinating in your bio that part of your job deals with training for lawyers who are assigned to poor clients, and what does that look like? Because you're talking to, I commend you. You realize there is a problem with our criminal justice system. You do realize there is some disproportionate impacts as it pertains to people of color. So I want to know now, how do you train other people to deal with that? I know you can handle that question, but right now, how the system disproportionately impacts people of color. I threw that out, whatever, tongue twister. But how is that? How does that impact people of color?
Well, number one, I think, how do you train people to deal with that? You have to educate them. And part of it is those folks like myself who have worked in the system, and folks that are impacted by the system need to be able to tell their stories. So the fact that there's more of these podcasts, there's more op-eds on the system, how the system actually works, and there's more written by people who have been impacted by the system, is awesome. So I recommend that people go out and they read those things. I just reread The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So in terms of like knowing how the system works and how the system disproportionately impacts people of color, definitely read that book. So
give it again, Dan, give it again.
It's The New Jim Crow.
The New Jim Crow, y'all. Go ahead and copy that. Yeah.
About 15 years old. It's a seminal book in understanding the criminal system.
Wow.
And its disproportionate impacts. So in terms of my own view and what I've seen and what the data actually shows, is that the system disproportionately impacts people of color largely on the front end, because there are certain practices that are in place that the police believe in. They're colorblind on their face, but they net mostly people of color into the system. They bring them in, they drag them in. That's another important part about the system, is that I don't know how to give it a percentage, assign it a percentage, but it's not somebody calls 911 and the police respond. That's, I don't even know, like 60%, 70%. So that's the majority of the system, but there's a huge chunk that is the police creating an interaction where it's just unwarranted. So it's in their view, and I've talked to a number of police officers, especially back in Pittsburgh, who say, well, this is our proactive way of fighting crime. What they do is they create traffic stops. Everybody commits traffic violations whenever they drive. They can pull anybody over that they want to pull over. And they target certain neighborhoods. And these certain neighborhoods are populated by largely people of color. It's low-hanging fruit. So they create traffic stops with an intent to search for some sort of evidence. They have no basis to believe that this person has any criminal evidence on them, but because there might be more shootings in this area, which are still only committed by a minuscule portion of the population, they use that as this justification that we should go and butt into people's business. Where if they did that anywhere, you're going to find some items. You're going to find people with guns that they shouldn't have because they don't have a license, or they can't possess it because of their criminal history, what have you. They're going to find drugs. Everybody has these things all over the place. So what they do is they go to certain neighborhoods, they target certain people, and it's random. But once they make a traffic stop, it only takes a couple more factors for them to develop reasonable suspicion. If they want to frisk somebody, that's a light search of the clothing or a quick search of the car. Probable cause to actually search the car. These are all things that are nebulous legal concepts that they can use to justify a search pretty much anytime they want. And they do that of people. Wow. So, and they do that of people on foot too, not just people in a car. So even though the hit rate, like when they find something, some small amount of drugs, a gun, even though it's very, very low, there are some places that did studies where they find guns less than 1% of the time, right? Yeah. Or drugs up to like less than 5% of the time. But if you do it enough, you're still going to net a ton of people into the system. So I would see in my practice, so many people charged with gun possession, drug possession, because of a police created interaction. And people think, well, at least you're bringing some people in who are committing crimes. No, because studies have shown that pretextual stops, stop and frisk, they don't reduce crime rates. They don't reduce violent crime rates. And that's what we're all focused on. And there was a great piece by the Marshall Project, actually, from last year that talked about gun possession and how gun possession is not related to violent crime. There's not even a correlation between people who illegally possess guns and people who commit violent crimes. But a lot of judges, prosecutors, everybody in the public thinks, oh my gosh, this person had a gun illegally. I say, so what? It's just a possession crime. So even the crimes that they're establishing when they find contraband by intruding into people's businesses are worthless. They basically just hurt communities. They hurt the people that they're bringing in. They create a lot of legwork for attorneys, for prosecutors, for judges to process these cases. And then it harms people because they stay in jail. They plead to misdemeanors, felonies. A lot of times it's felonies for gun possession, drug possession. Schedule 1 is a felony in Michigan. And I can't state to you I can't impress enough about how many of these cases would actually go to trial, because when it's a gun, everybody's scared that this person could use it violently. Nobody wants to say, oh, we can't prove our case, because a lot of these cases, even when they find a gun, their evidence is bad because the gun is in a glove box or something, and there's multiple people in the car. So these are the kind of cases that you would regularly try. They would regularly go to trial. And even though a prosecutor might admit to you in the hallway, hey, I don't think I can prove my case, we would still go to a jury trial because they want to just kick it to a jury, make someone else decide because they're scared. Their policies basically dictate a cover your A, right? So like that's the sort of processes that I'm talking about. When police disproportionately go fishing in largely minority areas, they pull a much higher percentage of people of color into the system on these types of crimes. And I also want to point out that sometimes
you went out, Dan, and it was getting
these
good.
Interactions lead to conduct. It leads to a threat because somebody is mad that the police are stopping them for no reason. So it's not just that they find things, there's crimes created on the interaction.
Man, Dan, let me tell you something. As you're talking, I'm sitting up here trying to contain myself because I'll just give you an example. There was a time I had bought a new vehicle. I'm going to tell my business, Dan. I forgot to get new tags. I forgot to get the registration tags, whatever. And I literally drove with expired tags for like months in the suburbs. But it wasn't until I went in Detroit. I'm going to tell you exactly where. Livernois and Davidson area. I was going through like that area. I got pulled over by the police. And I think they knew I was just like, whatever. In fact, I got out of the car. I was so nervous. He was like, ma'am, please. I was like, oh goodness. I was peed my pants. But anyway, it took me a while to process. I'm like, I said, I wasn't speeding. I thought it was for speeding. He was like, no, you have, your tags are, I was like, oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. And he was like, I think he was just overwhelmed with he was like, just go on. And he kind of told me what to do, go to court, this and that. And I went to court and they threw it out. But I just said, man, I was driving in all these suburbs for like months.
Right. Yeah.
And
Then all of a sudden
nobody,
you get to the city.
the city,
And you get pulled
the
over.
neighborhood, and I get pulled over. And I'm not talking about where I was driving real fast. I was like over, this cop literally had to go through to get me, you know, because I'm like, wait a minute, where did this come? I'm like, just, you know, I drive slow. And you know what I'm saying? So I was like, maybe I missed something because I couldn't think of what else, you know, and I was so nervous. So I'm just an example. Just I didn't plan to give you that story, but it proves what you're saying.
Yeah. And actually, you raise a good point that I left out the traffic violations themselves, because if you have expired tags, if you didn't pay your parking tickets, therefore your license is now suspended, those penalties mount up. So
Right.
then you have to pay. And if you're already poor, it makes you poorer. If you're not poor, you're just getting by. Now all of a sudden you can't drive and you got to pay all these fines. So it's the costs too that disproportionately impact people of color. I mean, if you're living in a poor area, I mean, back in Pittsburgh, and it's pretty much across the board, you have to pay money to get the benefits of the system. So, for instance, if somebody is middle class, but they just decide to steal something, and somebody's poor and they stole the same thing, if the person who's middle class and they got some money put away, they get charged, or they have family that can pay the restitution up front, basically, that person almost 10 out of 10 times is going to get that case dismissed. If the person who steals the same set of tools or something, who then can't pay back the money before the case resolved, before the court date, basically the trial date, they're going to be saddled with whatever the severity of the charge is. They're going to be convicted. So they're going to have that on their record. So it also plays a role in terms of who can pay what. Money determined who can get into a diversion program. The diversion program itself costs a lot of money. So if our clients over the span of 18 months say couldn't pay the cost of this diversion program, we would say, well, then I guess you shouldn't do it. Let's try a different route. So that's another way that the system disproportionately disadvantages the poor.
Wow.
So I want to point that out too. So that was a good segue. Thank you for that, Marjon. I'm sorry about those tags though.
No, I got it together. I know, but you know, this is like real life situations. And I'm not, you know, I was literally just trying to get from point A to point B. But like I said, it was one of those situations. I don't know why. Like I said, I brought up, you know, think about it. You're so used to getting your registration stuff or reminders when you have a regular car. But when you get a new one, it was kind of like, I don't know, between me and the dealership, I don't know who dropped the ball. I'm gonna say they did, but but you know, it's real life be life and stuff happens and everything. Y'all, if you just joined, I'm talking to Dan. Dan, I don't even, you know what? I didn't even say your last name. Tell everybody your last name, Dan. I don't want to butcher it.
It's Eichinger, and a lot of people butcher it. So that's
that's
really well played by you that you didn't give it a shot and butcher it. And then we have to do this whole thing where I'm like, oh no, it's actually this.
Dan, that's why I just say Dan, you know, and I don't even say his whole government name. And I just, you know, Dan is coming with his public defense, amazing, deep background. He was in Pittsburgh. Now he's in the D. What up, Doe? For all of you, you know, when we say Detroit, what up, Doe? And here's the thing in his bio. I want to talk about this because we've got about like 10 minutes left, Dan. And I want to talk about how in your bio, you talk about you publish articles advocating criminal legal reforms. Okay. And I want to talk about that's almost like, okay, we talked about the injustices of the criminal system and how it's so disproportionate. I even gave an example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time with expired tags. Talk to us about these publications advocating criminal legal reforms, because that's your way of giving back. You know?
Absolutely. So first off, the first article I wrote was about charges that are not supported by good evidence. I wrote that was an op-ed that was in Allegheny County back in Pittsburgh last January. So you can check that out. It's a microcosm of how the system works and the types of charges that I was talking about, like real low level or they're high level, but they're just not supported. And that was a systemic problem. Absolutely. So in terms of legal reform, that is highlighting for people that they need to hold the police, hold the prosecutors to account, that they shouldn't be charging folks with unsupported crimes. And despite there might be case law that says, you know what, this is insufficient evidence, but it didn't matter. They would still charge the same fact pattern over and over. So that's to encourage some sort of investigative standards that they have to abide by to avoid that systemic issue reoccurring. So that's the first article. The second article, I was very happy to work with this nonprofit called Zealous. And what they do is they're big on educating people about criminal reforms. And they also work in the background to actually change the law in various jurisdictions. They build coalitions, they educate public defenders in how to use the media. So I saw a workshop from them. They said they can help public defenders or former public defenders get pieces published. So I went to them with an op-ed idea. I already talked about pretextual stops. They helped me focus a piece that I had written on pretextual stops using a client story as an example. That was published in The Appeal in August of last year, 2023. So go check that out. And in that article, I not only talk about pretextual stops, but and how they don't work and how they target people of color. But my argument there is that you can't legislate pretext stops to not happen. You really need police buy-in. And there have been a couple places where the police chiefs didn't believe, they trusted the data basically. So they told their police officers, we don't want to do this. Let's just focus on actual driving hazards. And then we're going to focus on the big stuff. And what that did is it increased trust with the community. It actually reduced crime rates. So the whole point there was we need better police chiefs who trust the data and are able to change the hearts and minds of the rank and file. So that's where my novel approach came in, because there have been a lot of jurisdictions that mean well, but what they're doing is they're legislating to not make certain stops, but you can only make these secondary stops. And it's really confusing. And as long as you give police officers some avenue to make the stops that they believe are effective, they're going to keep doing them. So you really need to change the hearts and minds, in my opinion, of these officers. So that's where that piece came in. And then I recently released a report as a co-author regarding indigent defense reforms in Allegheny County. Indigent. So I have
that word indigent, and it means what? Poor.
Indigent. It means poor. Thank you.
Isn't that something? I would have never put those two words together, but go ahead, Dan.
So this report was just released. My friend and colleague, Rob Perkins, he's a criminal reform advocate. He's a private defense attorney, former public defender who takes assigned cases, which means he gets to represent poor folks. He advocates hard, speaks his mind for reforms, and he asked if I'd be a co-author. So I played a role in both writing the piece, editing the piece, and informing him as to how the Public Defender's Office in Allegheny County works. It's made a 180 since I started. I left the office in 2022. They got great management, but it still has some things it can improve on. It needs funding. It needs some new visions. So it's basically advocating for them to get better and for the assigned counsel system to basically just restart it because it's not good. Because what we're doing here in Michigan is a good model for an assigned counsel system. So when the public defender can't take cases, they largely go to private attorneys who are assigned to take cases. And there's really no standards as to their qualifications, their experience, and the pay is poor. And it's just a real piecemeal, shoddy system. So that's what a lot of the report is geared around, towards changing the assigned counsel aspect of Allegheny County system, but also improving the public defender's office. So you can find that if you just search for Allegheny County Criminal Defense Reforms Report, or you can go to he actually has his own nonprofit of defense attorneys interested in criminal reforms. I think it's called the Allegheny County or the Allegheny Lawyers Initiative for Justice.
Okay. And if not, they can reach out to you on Twitter at That Ain't Justice. Yes, we said it. Ain't Justice. That Ain't Justice as his handle, Dan. And so people, because people want to reach out to you and get that good information, and even some of the publications that they weren't able to get all of them. But kudos to you. And the reason I kind of threw that in, I didn't tell you I was going to do it, but I knew you could, rise to the cause, because it's one thing to do this work, but you see the injustice. It's all around in the job that you're doing and the jobs you've had before. But now my brother Dan he's writing op-eds, he's doing publications.
I'm trying
to make change. He's partnering with Michigan Liberation. We've been connected. It's going to be some beautiful things happening, Dan. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And you're going to be back, because we got some other topics we're going to have to and process, should I say. And the reason I say that is because it's so nice to talk to somebody who gets it, that's on the side of the legal side of everything. And I would love to come back and even hear your stories about training other people, because I know it's not easy. We just barely scratched the surface on this injustice of the criminal system.
For sure. Well, thanks for having me on, Marjon. This has been fantastic. This is really what I wanted to do when I left my former job. I'm still fighting for indigent defense. You need to build up both sides. The back end, when people have already been pulled into the system, you need to give them great defense, but you also need to change the front end that's continually bringing folks in with bad evidence, too many charges. It's just flooding the system, and it's causing a ton of harm. So I'm glad to speak out on that.
Thank you, Dan. We glad you're here in the D. And everybody, hey, as you know, Dan, everybody at the end of every episode, you gotta say respect the roots. So with this, we're getting ready to head out, and we're gonna do what, Dan?
Respect the roots.
All right, I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Till next time, everybody, remember to what, Dan?
Respect the roots.
There you go. Peace out, y'all. Stay on, Dan.
See ya.
But we're going, hey, goodbye to y'all. But hey, stay on, Dan.
For sure.
Michigan Liberation Education Fund, C3, conducts grassroots organizing, leadership development, and civic engagement activities. Michigan Liberation, C4, and Michigan Liberation Action Fund, IE, are sister organizations.